I think people are generally going to put these on and go, what's all the fuss about? Or they'll put them on and go, yeah, they're nice. I don't think many people are going to go, wow, that's just blown my mind. And yet, that's kind of where their magic lies. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're taking a look at the ZMF or ZMF Calderas. This is the flagship planar magnetic headphone from ZMF Headphones. But before we get into it, I want to send a message to Zach, who's the designer, owner, founder of ZMF Headphones, and that is to say, Zach, stop it, it's getting unfair. And what I mean by that is that ever since Zach started to produce the Atrium headphone and the internal Atrium damping system for the Atrium headphones, things have just been getting better and better at ZMF. Now, this doesn't mean that I love all their headphones. I'll get to that in a later review that's coming down the pipeline. But the combination that ZMF is now producing in terms of the look of the headphones, so for instance, this is a custom Atrium that is now mine, and I'm very thankful to Zach for helping me out with this design. I basically said to Zach, go nuts, do whatever you like. Here are some of the things I like the look of, and this is what came back, and it's absolutely spectacular in my opinion. So first and foremost, I think the aesthetic design of ZMF headphones is nothing short of spectacular. Their comfort is also top notch now. They've gone another step with the inclusion of a new headband design. And then we've got the combination of the Atrium damping system and the comfort and the physical looks in what is here as the Caldera. And so I'm not going to give away the full game here. These are not a perfect headphone. There are going to be some people that don't like these headphones, some people that love these headphones, like any really. But the key thing for me is that I'm seeing a trend from all the current ZMF line, being the Atrium, Auto Classic, the Caldera. I've also got the Atrium closed here now. All of these using the Atrium damping system, and it's absolutely elevated the performance and the sound quality of each of these models, in my opinion at least. That's not to say that older models like the Verite Open are no longer great. I'll cover that off in this review with the Caldera. But jokes aside, I think Zach is really onto something, and if he's not careful, he's going to put the rest of the headphone world out of the business. Now, clearly I'm joking there, but you get where I'm going here. Things are looking up at ZMF headphones. They've been good before, but they're heading into great territory. And now with all that preamble out of the way, I should add an extra warning to this video, and that is that it's a long one. If you didn't look at the time code before you jumped into this one, it's probably going to be a longer one. I don't know for sure yet. I've only just started recording, and I don't know how long it's going to take me to say everything I need to say. But my guess is by the end of it, this one's going to be a long one. So grab your favourite drink, order a 5-course meal, whatever you need to do. Let's get ready for a long chat about the ZMF Caldera.
You can never sleep in traffic. There's living steady panic. I know 'cause I tried acid. Now I see through your habits, just like gadgets. You tell me with the 2 hands, I'm too bad. Wonder what you think's I like. Need me to get your bills paid. That's what you said. Well, guess I'm just too fake for that. So sit down, listen, think for a minute. Know it might be hard 'cause you're uneducated. Break down, face it, breathe for a minute. I'm about to help you with your manners and respect. You get it, just uneducated. But this so but you make it.
Coming in at $3,500 US, these are clearly the most expensive headphone in the range from ZMF. They're also currently the only planar magnetic headphone in the ZMF lineup. And being a planar magnetic at the price they are, it puts them alongside other excellent headphones like the Meze Elites or the Meze Empyreans, also alongside the HiFiMan HE1000 SE. There's multiple models that they're naturally going to be compared to, and then also to the other options in ZMF stable, such as the Verite Open and the Atrium. So I'm going to cover off all of those. I need to talk about some different pad options on these. I need to talk about cables. And that's why I said in the intro, this is going to be a longer review than usual. As always, there's chapter markers. Feel free to skip around as much as you need to. But let's start by diving into the specifications of the Caldera. I've already mentioned that it is a planar magnetic driver, but on top of that, it's a 60 ohm driver with 95 decibel sensitivity. And what that means is it's moderately difficult to drive. It's by no means a hard headphone to drive. I ran it quite comfortably off some portable devices when I was doing my review of the Death & Ray Pegasus SG1 and the Shanling UP5. They were all comfortably driving the Calderas here and sounding fantastic, I should add. And so they're not exactly difficult to drive, but they're not a super easy, super portable headphone. Working alongside the driver, as we've come to expect from ZMF, We've got lovely wooden cups. I actually don't recall which version of the cups these are. These are not a standard cup on the Calderas. They're one of the limited edition timbers that's been used for this one. And then inside the wooden cups and behind this beautiful grille here, what we've then got going on the inside is the Atrium damping system. Now, I won't go into that in detail here. There's a lot more information in one of my previous interviews with Zach and Bevan from ZMF. But basically what you've got is a specially designed internal damping system which is intended to affect how the waves come off the back of the driver, how the resonance and reflections happen or don't happen, hopefully, inside the cups. And as I said at the intro, my experience of the Atrium damping system is that it always seems to improve headphones. Whether or not you like the end tuning, that's a whole other question. But so far I haven't heard a headphone that Zach has produced with the Atrium damping system that isn't benefiting from its characteristics. If we move around to the front of the cups, we've now got some new pads designed specifically for the Calderas, but also, interestingly, being used on some other headphones too. And these pads use a combination of perforated and solid leather, as well as some new tapering and contouring of the pads to do a couple of things. And the main things are that it helps to funnel the sound towards the ear and also produces a little bit more pressure behind and below the ear to help seal it there. And it definitely works, both in good and bad. So what I mean by that is it does give you an excellent sense of seal and comfort on the head. Where it's probably not always the best for me at least, is that it seals so well that depending on what I do, certain movements and even things like taking the headphone off, you can actually hear a little bit of suction causing the driver to move a little bit. It's not bad or uncomfortable and it won't damage the driver, but it does two things. Firstly, it goes to show you that there is a good seal there, and secondly, it reminds you you've got a headphone on your head. It doesn't generally happen during normal listening. As I said, it's only when very specific movements happen, such as taking the headphone off, or the other day I was eating while I had the headphones on, and the movement of my jaw would cause that sort of break and seal and that slight suction. But it's generally very rare that it happens during normal listening, so it's not an issue, but I did want to point it out as both a sign that the pads are working and also something to listen for, and not to be worried about if you hear it. Carrying on a few more moments about the design, what else we've got going on in here are some trapezoidal magnets, and these are going to work in a similar way but differently to the HiFiMan stealth magnets, for instance. And the whole idea, this has been done multiple times now by Audeze with their phaser magnets, HiFiMan with their stealth magnets, and this is now ZMF's approach at the trapezoidal magnets to minimise the impact of the magnet structures on the airflow going through them. And the idea is that the sound wave isn't going to get disrupted or blocked coming off the face of the diaphragm and reaching your ear. While we're speaking about that membrane and the sound that it produces, the other thing I thought was really interesting was that when Zach has talked about the design process for the Caldera on his website, one of the things he spoke about was the choice of membrane thickness. And I spoke to him on an episode of the Passion for Sound podcast. I'll try to remember to link that down below, but if not, just go searching for it in whatever your favourite podcast platform is. And on that episode of the podcast, what he talked about was the fact that he actually listened to a whole lot of different planars and took note of the thickness of the diaphragms to find what he thought was the sweet spot in order to have both a balance of the weight and body in the sound, but also speed and attack in the sound too. And I have to say, without giving too much away, I think he's done a great job of finding that balance point. And so in terms of design, you've got some new technology here, you've got some continuations of existing technology, such as the Atrium damping system, and all of it's packaged up in this beautiful, beautiful housing. For those of you not familiar with ZMF before this video, the things I also should mention are that you've got a tilting mechanism here for the driver cups. You've then got also a rotation, so you can adjust these as much as you need to get them comfortable. You've got a ratchet system, so there's quite a bit of adjustment there for larger and smaller heads, as well as the ability for the headband to bend. And then I've already mentioned you've got this new style headband. It's what they call the crescent style headband. So there's multiple bumps there that distribute the load and mean you don't get hotspots in wearing these. Finally, on the bottom of the cups, we've got mini XLR inputs. So you get a couple of those, which means these can run balanced. They don't need to be run balanced necessarily, but you can do that if you want to. And then that leads us onto the cables. My one big complaint about these headphones is I think the cables that they come with really aren't up to scratch for a headphone of this level. The cable that comes with it, and I've got it in a bit of a cable cinch here because it's just unwieldy. In fact, let me take it out of the cinch and show you. It's just a cable that wants to hold its shape, so it keeps that kind of coil and kink in it no matter what you do. It's just not an enjoyable cable to interact with. So this is the stock cable. There are upgrade cables available. There's also a shorter braided cable you can get, which has a fabric sleeving on it, which is a bit nicer to use. I don't know if it sounds better or worse, or if it's just the same. I haven't really played around with it too much. Because my first thing with the Calderas was to start playing with cables, partly because this one was not enjoyable, but also I was interested to hear what they could do. And I have to say that for me, immediately I preferred the sound of the Calderas with either a slightly better quality copper Litz cable, and that doesn't have to be crazy expensive, it's more about the Litz bringing out a bit more detail and resolution in the sound. And then the other cable that I've really enjoyed with them, and I'm not sure which one is actually my favourite, is this pure silver Litz from Gladiator Cables. So it doesn't matter where you get the cables from, I'm only mentioning this so you know exactly what I'm talking about, but I've found that both a pure silver Litz cable or a pure copper Litz cable both sound wonderful on the Caldera, and in my opinion are a worthy upgrade over the stock cables from ZMF. Now ZMF have their own upgrade cables with Litz wiring and the like, so you can get it all from the one place if you want to. I just wanted to mention it for those of you that are looking at buying these and wondering if you should buy a different cable. I think yes, you should. To clarify that further, let me give you a couple of really quick listening notes on this one because I don't want to spend too long on cables. But as I listened to What a Wonderful World by KD Lang and Tony Bennett, as I went between the stock cable that I showed you, that really coily one, and then moving over to the copper Litz cable, what I found was that everything stayed much the same in terms of tonality. There was no shift in the kind of overall sound of the headphone in terms of its tonal response, but there was just a greater sense of resolution, a slightly greater sense of space in the sound as a result. Everything just opened up, became more fluid and more easy to listen to with no change in tonality. And so that's really a key for me. If I'm spending $3,500 on a headphone, I expect it to perform at that top level. As I said, alongside Elites, HiFiMan HE1000 SEs, etc. And for me, it needed the extra cable, much like the Elites do as well. So this is not the only case where a flagship headphone needs an upgrade cable. I feel like the Elites are in the same boat. But for me, they really came alive once I attached that better quality cable. As to which is going to be better or worse for you, probably check out my recent review of some Gladiator headphone cables where I talked through the copper versus the hybrid copper-silver versus the silver to get an understanding of which tonality is going to be best for you. For my mind, I wouldn't bother with the hybrid on the Calderas, I don't think it helps them, but the pure copper or the pure silver both could be fantastic. But to better understand which cable might work for you, we really need to understand the general sound of the Calderas, and that's a bit tricky, because these are a headphone that's designed for pad rolling. So they come with a standard pad, but you can also order a thick version of the pad, a thin version of the pad, or a suede version of the pad, and all of them have different sounds. I will go through pad rolling later because it's more of an optional thing than a necessary thing. For me, the cable is a bit more necessary on these. But I raise pads at this point just to let you know that all of my testing has been done with my preference, and that is with the thick Caldera pads. So everything I'm talking about here is with the thick Caldera pads. At the end of the video, I'm going to go through how they sound with the thin, the thick, the standard, and the suede, as well as the mantle, which is a piece that can go over the front of the driver and just damp some of the high end. So I'll go through all of that at the end. You can skip through if you want to get to that now. But for now, I'm going to jump into the sound quality and talking about it always with the thick pads for now. It's worth noting it's not a massive shift in sound quality, so everything I'm going to be saying here is going to be mostly transferable with any of the pads. But there'll be just that little bit more context at the end when you hear my thoughts on the pad rolling. If you're trying to work out what piece of gear you should buy next, then the Passion for Sounds Recommends database might be helpful for you. In the description box of every single video, just down here, you'll find the Passion for Sounds Recommends section. If you click on this link, it'll take you through to the Passion for Sounds Recommends Airtable database. What you'll see in here is every single product that I've ever reviewed and recommend, in some cases products that I own but maybe haven't reviewed but recommend. And then once you're in here, you can use the filter button up here to decide to filter by things like whether or not the product type is for a headphone, for example. So maybe you're looking for a headphone. Filter it by that and you can now see every headphone I recommend. You can sort it by price, which is the default sorting, or any other sorting method that you want. And then once you've got the list of products you're looking for, you've got the links to the reviews of the products, and then also purchasing links for global retailers and also regional retailers for the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So feel free to play around with this, sort it, filter it however you want to. It won't affect what anybody else sees, and you can hopefully find just the right products for you. I hope this is helpful, and now let's get back to the review. And so let's talk now about what I heard when I first listened to the Calderas. And I say first listened, I did allow them to burn in. I made sure they had plenty of time in case they changed. I didn't really notice that they did change very much. But just in case people think they do, I gave them plenty of time just playing, burning in, listening to them occasionally. But it was only after a good week or so of use and extended playing that I came back for a proper listen. And the first and most obvious thing for me with the Calderas was that they've got a lovely sense of attack and clarity on leading edges. So when you hear a guitar strum or a snare hit, something that should have a sharp sense of attack to it, that very sharp start to the sound, they do that beautifully. And in fact, for me, they're one of the best headphones I've heard at that. The Susvara is probably the ultimate headphone I've ever heard for that leading edge sound, and the Calderas sit right there behind them. Possibly not quite as good, but right there behind. I feel like the treble from the Calderas is detailed, it's there, it's present, it's solid, but not overly enhanced in any way. But then as we move down into the mid-range, I do feel like the upper mids are just a little bit forward. They're not massively forward, they're not in your face, they don't get shouty to me. But it does give them a slightly dry sound, depending on your source, depending on the cable you choose as well, and this is where a silver cable can kind of add a little bit to that, for better or worse, whereas a copper can pull back on it a bit comparatively to silver. They do come across just a little bit dry and a little bit forward in that upper mid-range, but that's also partly where their magic lies, and I'll explain that a lot more as we go through. One area that is both a blessing and a curse is in terms of the mid-range presentation and vocal presentation. And that is to say that the Calderas give you a lovely sense of texture and body in vocals. That upper mid-range forwardness gives you that wonderful sense of texture, rasp and breath in vocals. Saxophones sound amazing on these. I've seen other people comment on the fact that snares sound brilliant, and I agree. So that level of texture and detail in the upper mids is great from the Calderas. But on the flip side, having that extra upper mid-range energy can prevent them from sounding deep and spacious. It brings the sound closer to you, not congested, but physically the positioning of the instrumentals and vocals for that matter, is closer to start with. It doesn't start sort of 4 or 5 rows away from you, it starts as if you're sitting in, say, the second row. Now, some people love that, some people don't like that so much, but for me, as I listen more and more, I don't mind it in the Calderas. It's a trade-off situation, as every single headphone tends to be, and it's a trade-off that I definitely don't mind making. But we will talk more about that when I start to get to the comparisons and explain where it works and where it doesn't work so well for the Calderas. The bass from these is wonderfully extended, wonderfully present, wonderfully full, but not at all enhanced. They're not what I would call a bassy headphone so much as a full, solid sounding headphone. So if you think about something like a Meze Empyrean, that's absolutely bassy. If you think about something like a Meze Elite, it's got an interesting mixture of sort of a slightly mid-bass emphasis, and then going down into the sub-bass, it sort of tapers off a little bit, but it does extend all the way down. And I think these are closer to the Elite than they are to the Empyrean, but they're also doing it quite differently. And that's largely because of the way the full frequency range balances, and that's the key for me with the Calderas. They're a very balanced sounding headphone. They're not completely uncoloured, they've got their own character and sound, but they're not pushing any particular frequency forward, and it makes them, for me at least, a very natural sounding headphone overall. There is a little bit of roll-off in the bass, so they're not going to give you that sub-bass experience like, say, a Dan Clark Audio Expanse is going to give you. But on the flip side, I actually think they're better tonally balanced than the DCA Expanse. Because they don't have that shouty forward mid-range, they haven't got that mid-bass lift either, it means that they do tend to balance all different sounds just a little bit better. Again, they're not perfect, I'm not sitting here saying they're the best headphone around, but they're a headphone that I thoroughly enjoy for their tonal accuracy. Moving into the technicalities, and I feel like they're a very technical headphone without kind of shoving it forwards at you. They're not the most technical headphone, they're not like a Susvara for instance, but at the same time they're kind of sneakily technical. And what I mean is that as you listen to them, nothing's ever missing, but also nothing's ever highlighted, nothing's ever brought forward, and that goes back to the tonal balance we just spoke about. Some headphones will pull out certain frequencies to help others come forwards, or they'll peak certain frequencies to make sure that there's an emphasis somewhere, and I don't feel like that's really happening with the Calderas so much. There are little bits and pieces of emphasis, but there's nothing that really stands out, and therefore nothing that detracts from anything else. The sound staging of these, as I've already kind of mentioned, isn't particularly deep. You don't start the soundstage a long way away, and the soundstage itself doesn't stretch very deep either, but they do give a nice sense of shape in the soundstage. It's quite left-right, but it has got a little bit of that sphericality I often talk about. And the key thing for me is that all of the sounds within the soundstage are beautifully separated. So there's no sense of congestion, claustrophobia, or being overly intimate, but I would also mention for those that are all about soundstage, they don't give you that sense of depth and expansive space that something like a Meze Elite can do. So keep that in mind. It's going to come down to your preferences, what you value, what you don't value, what you prioritize. That's really where the split's going to be for these. As I moved across listening to all different genres, what I found was that these are actually fantastic for classical, so long as you're not looking for an expansive soundstage, like I just mentioned. One thing they do really well for classical, if you're listening to chamber music or smaller ensemble type pieces, is they give you a lovely sense of the resonance and the harmonics and the richness of the instruments you're listening to. And so while they're maybe not going to give you the experience of listening to something like a Susvara or an HD800S, where you get all that detail, all that space within an orchestral performance, I feel like they do give you a better sense of body and balance across the frequency range. So it's going to depend on what you're looking for once again. If we then go in the other direction, we talk about more rhythmic music, so your rock, your blues, your funk, etc., that's where the Caldera really comes to life for me. They're not as fun as something like a Meze Empyrean, which is definitely coloured and fun and it's just all about foot tapping. But at the same time, they'll absolutely give you a groove. They'll give you the rhythm, the energy and the soul of the music, and you can groove along to anything. And so for me, that's where I'm finding them a great all-rounder. They're a headphone that I can easily reach for anything and everything. I can listen for long periods, I can really focus in and listen technically, or I can just relax and let the music wash over me. They're really working well across the board. But that's also their weakness. You don't put these on and go, wow, these are the best things I've ever heard. That sense of energy and those leading edges I spoke about earlier, that's definitely a little bit of a wow factor for me when I first put them on. But I don't think these are a headphone that people are going to pick up, put on and say, this is the best thing I've ever heard. I think people are generally going to put these on and go, man, what's all the fuss about? Or they'll put them on and go, yeah, they're nice. I don't think many people are going to go, wow, that's just blown my mind. And yet that's kind of where their magic lies. And I'll come back around to that at the end and just kind of clarify what I mean by that. But first I want to talk about some specific comparisons and also some amp pairings. In terms of amp pairings, I tried a lot of different amplifiers with the Calderas. And what I'd say is that they're pretty easy to drive. They're not going to take a power station to run them. And they sounded good with pretty much everything I've got here. The only thing I didn't enjoy them so much with was something like the Folkvanger. And that was largely because it's just not a good synergy. The Folkvanger could drive them just fine. There was no issue for power and drivability. It was more just a lacking of synergy. The Folkvanger's got this very liquid, smooth sound. And I feel like the energy of the Calderas is what makes them magic, and it didn't necessarily have that from the Folkvanger. The Folkvanger is very much more of an amplifier for driving dynamic headphones, it seems. It's such an amazing pairing with something like the Atrium over there that it's a very, very tough act to follow. And for me, the Caldera didn't even come close. But that's not a knock on the Folkvanger or the Caldera, it's just not a good synergy. On the other hand, going between things like the Amp23R from Enlium, the Phonitor XE from SPL, or the Burst & Soloist GT, all of those sounded fantastic with the Caldera. An incredible match with any of those. You're going to be very, very happy. The other one that I found wasn't the best matching was with something like the Chord Hugo TT2, and that really comes down to the fact that the TT2 headphone stage is very dry, it's very neutral, kind of just very, very honest in not always the best way. It works beautifully with a headphone like the Meze Elites, but because of the upper mid-range tuning from the Calderas, it wasn't my favourite pairing. It wasn't bad by any stretch. I think I could completely enjoy just having the Calderas and the TT2 as my only combination, but my preference would be to derive the Calderas from one of those other amps that I just mentioned. And so knowing that the Calderas can run quite happily from basically any amplifier, obviously they're a headphone at the level where you want a very good quality amplifier, but once you've got that in place, let's now talk about whether you should buy the Calderas or a different headphone around the same price. The first comparison I looked at was the identically priced HiFiMan HE1000 SE, and the first thing I'll mention is that in terms of build quality and finish, it's an absolute no contest. These are comfortable enough to wear for long periods, but they don't feel anywhere near as good as the Calderas do. Listening to House of Jazz by AC/DC while comparing these two, and the first thing I noticed was the bass quality and articulation from the Caldera. That is the overall sense of articulation and the quality of the bass. The vocals are clear and separated with the Caldera, but still with a good sense of body and presence. And then as I switched over to the HE1000 SE, I found myself having to drop the volume a little bit, because they're just a bit more aggressive in the upper end. Overall, their sound is splashier as a result, but at the same time the vocal is a bit more recessed. So you're getting a little bit of a V-shaped sort of feel from the HE1000 SE versus that more neutral, more balanced sound from the Calderas with a slight emphasis on upper mid-range. Depending on the amp or the track, as I went back and forth with these two, what I found was the HE1000 SE can at times come across sounding a bit more detailed, a bit sort of clearer, a greater sense of clarity in other words. But what that's really about is I think the tuning where certain frequencies are being pulled out of the sound from the HE1000 SE and allowing others to kind of just sit there on their own a bit better. Whereas the Caldera seems to be trying to cover all frequencies equally, and that can work both for them and against them. I think if you're looking for a headphone that is going to keep the mid-range, so your vocals, your core instrumentals, if it's going to keep all of those really well balanced with everything else, I think the Caldera is better. But if you're looking for a headphone that's more focused on clarity and separation of sounds, that's where some of the deliberate cuts in the HE1000 SE could be to their advantage. So it's going to depend on what you're looking for, and it's one of those cases where I can't really recommend one over the other. I know personally I'm reaching more for the Caldera than I am for the HE1000 SE, but if there's those of you in the comments that are writing down right now that the HE1000 SE is the better headphone, I don't at all disagree. Not to say I think it is the better headphone, but I can understand why some people will feel that way. For some people, it's going to be better. For others, the Caldera will win. All I know is that for me, the Caldera is the one I reach for, and that's always the ultimate test of the headphones for me. But what about some other headphones other than the HE1000 SE? The next headphone I tested was over here in the ZMF Atrium. As I said, this is probably the most spectacular looking headphone I've ever seen, but coming in at $1,000 cheaper than the Caldera, I really wanted to put them side by side. I already knew that I loved the Atrium, but I was curious to see if the Atrium was actually as good of a headphone and if people could save themselves $1,000 and go for an Atrium instead of a Caldera. I ended up trying a couple of different tracks in this test, and the first one I started with was Cripple and the Starfish by Anthony and the Johnsons. The Caldera came across very coherent, very balanced and very smooth, not lacking in texture, but at the same time very, very kind of, as I said, balanced across the board. And the only knock that I really had as I listened to this was that I felt like I wanted just a bit more space for the orchestra. Things felt just a little bit lacking in that sense of expansive soundstage once the orchestra came in, and that was probably the one place that I felt the Caldera might have been letting me down, but it might have also been the recording, and so I switched over to the Atriums to see how they presented the same. And indeed, the Atriums, one of the things I love about them is they have got quite a spacious soundstage. It's not huge, but it's got a lovely sense of depth to it, and I felt like that did improve a little bit what I was hearing when I listened from the Atriums. But they also showed me that they're a less detailed headphone. And this goes back to what I said before. The Calderas are a sneaky detailed headphone. They don't push it at you, they don't highlight it, but it's all there. With the Atriums, there is a bit of a trade-off. They're not the most resolving or revealing headphone around, they're more about the overall musical enjoyment. And one area that this really stood out was in the sibilant sound, so it sounds like a S sound. You could actually hear more texture in those sounds, not that it was more aggressive or louder or harsher, but you could hear more of the detail in those sounds from the Caldera than you could from the Atrium. It's not something you'd notice if you weren't going back and forth between them, but it was definitely a sign that for me, the Caldera is the technically superior headphone. For musical enjoyment, it's going to be one of those personal preference things. I love both of these. I think the Atrium with the Folkvanger is one of the greatest combinations I've ever heard in my entire audio journey, not technically, but just enjoyment-wise. And so both are fantastic, but I can absolutely see from this comparison why the Caldera is worth the extra $1,000. The other track that I tried quickly with these two before I moved on was Appreciate by Paul McCartney, and that again reinforced what I've just said. The Atrium sounded lovely here, but it wasn't blowing my mind. It sounded like a fantastic $2,500 headphone. Whereas when you go up that extra step into the stratosphere with headphones like the Elites, the HE1000 SE, etc., you're really expecting that last level of resolution, detail, clarity, and technicalities, and that's what the Caldera gave me. The Caldera was able to give me more texture in the sound, it separated the sounds better, it really just showed that it's on another level of technical performance. And so I was about ready to move on to the Elites, which for me was the most kind of relevant and interesting comparison because the Elites have been my favourite planar to date, and I was curious to see if this could knock them off their throne. But before we get there, I also want to briefly mention the Verite Opens. There'll be those of you that maybe have the Verite Open and you're wondering if the Caldera is the next step up. For those not familiar, the Verite Open was for a long time kind of the flagship headphone from ZMF. The Atrium sits right alongside it, so they're both $2,500 headphones. And so that begs the question whether the Verite Open, with its sort of faster, more resolving sound, was actually as good as the Caldera. And this was a really interesting test. I was listening to What a Wonderful World by Katie Malua and Eva Cassidy, and it's complete coincidence that I ended up listening to that track here and the Katie Lang and Tony Bennett version earlier. I only just realised that. But that's what I was listening to for this test. And starting with the Caldera, the sound was wonderfully defined, but also quite intimate. I don't want to harp on this, but these are not a headphone for those of you that want a big, expansive soundstage. They bring you close to the music without feeling claustrophobic. The vocals from the Caldera were smooth, but still very textured, and the bass had a nice sense of presence to it without dominating anything. It was generally a very, very good listen. Moving over to the Verite Open, and my first thought was that they were better on this track. The vocals had this lovely kind of ethereal sense of separation. Each of the two vocals kind of hovered in space with the rest of the music wrapped around them. But as I carried on listening, what I noticed was that the Verite Open was also a little bit harsher on sibilants. Or not harsher, that's probably too strong. It had more energy on sibilants. And as time went on, and this is going to depend a little bit on the source chain, but as time went on, I did feel like the Verite Open was the less relaxing listen. It was going to get fatiguing sooner for me. And this comes back again to what I said at the beginning of this review, or early on in this sound section at least, which is that these are a headphone that I don't think people are going to put on and go, wow. I think for me, going from the Caldera to the Verite Open, I put on the Verite Opens and I went, wow, that's amazing. And yet, when I came back to the Caldera for longer listens and went back and forth between the two, as time went on, it was actually the Caldera that I continued to prefer. Now, if you put the Verite Open on a highly revealing tube amp, so something like the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 that I've got over here, that can start to level the playing field a little bit by taking just a tiny bit of the edge off the upper end of the Verite Open. But I don't feel like the Verite Open can ever match the Caldera across all genres. For a beautiful female vocal like this one, they work wonders. But as I move through multiple tracks, that tonal balance and overall sense of body and presence that the Calderas have, that again had me reaching for them over the Verite Opens every single time. And so it all comes back to that for me. Which one do I actually enjoy listening to the most? Which one do I reach for the most? And for this comparison with the Verite Open, it's clearly the Caldera again. Thanks for sticking with me. We're getting close to the end of the kind of main section of the review. And the next headphone that I reached for was the Meze Elites over behind me here. The Meze Elites are one of the most beautiful and comfortable headphones that I've ever tried. And I was quite shocked to find as I spent more and more time with the Calderas and the Elites, that I actually find the Calderas just as comfortable as the Elites. And that's a huge statement. I think from a pure engineering point of view, the Elites probably still have the edge with their headband design. It's beautifully finished. Everything is just absolutely masterful the way it's been put together. But in terms of on-the-head comfort and long-term wearing, I could easily go for either of them. And that means that the Caldera is now kind of the equal 1A for me as the most comfortable headphones I've owned. If you're not familiar with the Meze Elites, they come in $500 more than the Calderas at $4,000 US. So they're in that absolute top of the range flagship level headphone category, and therefore it was definitely for me what I expected to be the toughest challenge for the Calderas. And that definitely proved to be true. This is a comparison of two headphones that I could absolutely live with either forevermore as my only headphone. Starting off with the Elgar Cello Concerto in E minor, and the quality of the cello's kind of texture and resonance, the overall balance of the sound was spectacular from the Calderas. The solo cello was also very well separated from the rest of the orchestra, but then I did find as the passages got a bit busier, it did get a bit muddled from the Caldera. This is largely due to the recording, but it's also because that balanced tonality of the Calderas doesn't pull any tricks. It doesn't try to do anything to help separate sounds out, and that means that you get to hear everything, but it also means that a recording that's a bit muddled isn't going to be kind of more separated out by their sound. Moving over to the Elites, and what I found was that those same busy passages were still very, very busy. Even the Elites tuning, which has got a few of those tricks in it, even that couldn't completely fix this recording. Having said that, what the Elites did do was give a greater sense of detail and clarity in the sound, but it came at a cost. And that is that there was less sense of weight and presence in their sound. The Elites have got good bass to them, but because of their overall balance of the tuning, there's some lumps and some bumps within the frequency response. The end result of all that is a sound that can get a little bit delicate, a little bit lightweight sometimes, compared to the very much full range balance of the Caldera. And I'm not sitting here saying one's better or worse, they're just different. There are times that I love what the Elites do and the way they separate sounds out, they give that sense of detail and clarity, but then there's other times that I love the full range balance of the Calderas. Moving over to a different track in the form of Waiting for Love by Pink, and the Elites gave that wonderful sense of clarity and rhythm. The vocal from Pink was clean and detailed, but slightly pushed back from me. It wasn't quite as kind of present as I might have liked it to be. And the overall sound I would have described from the Elites as being quite crispy. What I meant by that was there was a sense of attack and clarity in the upper frequencies, whereas when I moved over to the Calderas, it was less crispy, but more articulate. It's like you can hear more of the energy and feel more of the energy from the mid-range and those upper mids, rather than being focused on the treble with a cut in the mids. And so again, it's going to come down to preferences. The Calderas also brought the vocal closer to me. It wasn't too close, it wasn't claustrophobic, but it was a more intimate presentation. And so it's going to depend on what you value. And that really brings us around to kind of my conclusions for these from a basic sonic point of view. And what I mean is I'm going to carry on in a moment and talk about pad rolling. But having gone through all the comparisons, these are a fascinating headphone. And I mean that because they're a headphone that I'm having a hard time sitting here and absolutely recommending. And that's not because I don't love them. I absolutely adore them. They've become my go-to headphone. They've dethroned the Elites as the headphone I reach for first. And that says worlds about them from that point of view. But at the same time, I'm not sitting here saying everybody should go out and buy a pair, because they're a headphone that I think you need to kind of learn to appreciate, and even that's too strong, and this is where they're so hard to kind of quantify. They're a headphone that I absolutely love, but they're a headphone that I don't think everyone is going to be wowed by. I think some people are going to buy these. If I was to sit here and say you absolutely should try them, I think they're a headphone that some people are going to try and go, what's all the fuss about? Other people are going to try and go, I don't like how they sound. And that's largely because they sound different from most other headphones. They don't follow some of the same tricks of cutting some of the upper mid-range. They don't follow the tricks of something like a Dan Clark Audio Expanse, where they've given that really thick, meaty bass sound, and then also pushed forward the mid-range to try to balance that. And so what they tend to do is they sound very natural, but they don't sound impressive. And for me, I'll take natural every single day, particularly natural with that sense of attack and clarity and energy. I'll take that every single day because I can listen to it all day long. It's true that I can also listen to the elites all day long, but I do know some people that don't really enjoy that sort of cut sound in the upper mids and that slightly lightweight sound they produce. And so that's why I'm sitting here not saying absolutely go and buy a pair, but I would go as far as saying you should absolutely try a pair. See if you can try a pair at a show, or maybe a dealer that has them, if there are any dealers that have them. Try to get your hands on them, try to have a listen to them, and give them a bit of time. It's a little bit like that analogy that I've talked about sometimes before on the channel of TVs. When you walk into a TV showroom and some of the TVs have the saturation and the contrast boosted to be impressive when they're on the floor, and you look at them in the showroom and you go, wow, that's amazing, then you get them home and maybe it's a bit too much. Whereas there might be other TVs that maybe don't wow you in the showroom, but because they look more natural overall, their colour balance, their contrast, everything's actually a bit more true to life, they're the ones that you get home and you're more likely to enjoy everything and anything for the long term. And that to me is very much what the Calderas are doing. They're an everything and everything long-term headphone that I just thoroughly love. And so if you can go into listening to a pair or even buying a pair based on what I've just said, I think you're going to be really impressed. But if you're looking for a jaw-dropping wow moment the second you put them on, I think you could be disappointed because they're not that kind of headphone. They are very, very impressive in terms of what they're doing, but it's because of their subtlety. It's because of their balance. It's because they're not pushing anything forward. So take all that into account. I do want to recommend them, but I also want to recommend them with a caveat that some people aren't going to get it when they first listen. And that's not because there's some kind of audiophile secret sauce going on that only I know how to listen to them. My point is that they're different. They're different from what we expect. They're different from, if I go from the Elite to the Caldera, it takes my brain a minute to adjust to them. Once I do, I absolutely adore them, and going back to the Elites, it sounds like something's missing. And so for me, the Calderas absolutely deserve to sit right alongside the Elites, the HE1000 SEs, even the Susvaras. I've described to my patrons that I think the Calderas are kind of like a mixing pot of the Susvaras in terms of that sense of attack and energy on the leading edges, but also balanced off with some of the kind of the note weight and the presence of something like the Elites. And yet at the same time, they've got more presence than the Elites in that upper mid-range area, and that fills out the spectrum beautifully. And so I love the Calderas. I will certainly be looking to get a pair for myself. They're likely to be my main go-to headphone from now on. And hopefully you can try them and see if you love them as much as well. And so I'm going to wrap up the main review there with just a reminder that everything I've said so far is based on the thick pads. It's also based on the fact that I do think they need an upgraded cable in the form of a copper Litz or maybe a silver Litz cable. And I've tossed and turned between whether I like the silver or the copper more, so I'm not going to try to say which one's better. But in case you're keen to try the Calderas for yourself, whether it's a demo, whether it's buying them directly, let me now quickly run through some pad rolling. And there's a couple of things to know about the Calderas. One thing is that you can also get these mantle pads. Now these mantle pads go on the front of the driver, so basically they're sticky as you can just see. So basically you take off the pad, you've got the front of the driver there, and these are actually an adhesive system that just goes over, if I can line it up properly. And I haven't lined it up quite properly, but you get the idea. They just go over the front of the driver like that. Now this was something that Zach actually produced after the Caldera was all done. It wasn't an afterthought so much as a response to feedback from some of his customers. And so this is designed to damp some of the upper frequencies from the Caldera. You can obviously use it with any of the pads. I've only tried it with the thick pads and the standard pads, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the one thing I do want to call out, one of the questions I had is why is it an adhesive system rather than being like the Titan mesh on, say, the Atrium, where you actually removed a couple of screws and screwed it into place? And what Zach said, and I think this is important to know, what Zach said is that the screws around the outside of the drivers for the Caldera are actually part of the mounting mechanism for the driver itself. And so you don't want to go pulling apart those screws because the magnets are attached there. It's how everything's held together. So you don't want to go messing with that. And that's why it's actually just an adhesive system. The good news is I've put these on and off at least 4 or 5 times now, I think, and they're still sticking, no problems at all. So that's what the mantle's all about, but let's talk about how it actually sounds. The first thing to mention is that I started all of this testing with the stock pads on the Calderas. And with the stock pads, the Calderas have just a little bit too much aggression in the upper end for me. They can get just a little bit too energetic sometimes. I love that sense of tactility and articulation that they have, but it could just be a little bit fatiguing. And certainly putting on the mantle with the stock pads does help to balance that off a little bit, but it's also worth noting that it is going to steal a little bit of the energy from the sound of the Calderas. So it's going to tame the top end, but it's also going to tame that sense of articulation and the leading edge attack. And for me, the thing I love most about the Calderas is that leading edge attack. And so it's a bit of a trade-off there. With the stock pads, I do think the mantle helps to balance out the tonality just a bit better. It takes a little bit of energy away from the treble, which means the bass feels and comes across a little bit fuller. And the overall staging stays about the same, which for me, with the stock pads on the Calderas, is just a little bit too intimate sometimes. Basically, the thicker the pad, the more sense of depth you'll generally get in the soundstage. And for me, the Calderas with the stock pads, it's probably one area that I do think they're a bit lacking. They're quite left-right, they don't have a huge amount of depth. And so the stock pads on their own, I think, are just a little bit too aggressive. Adding in the mantle helps to tame that, but still some articulation. And so ideally for me, I'd move away from the stock pads entirely. It's not that they sound bad, and some people are going to absolutely love them, but if you're using the stock pads with a very neutral sounding source chain that's not smoothing anything off, and then particularly if you add something like a silver cable, I find the Calderas can be just a little tiny bit too much. They're not bad or harsh or nasty, but I just know they can be better with different pads. Moving over to the thick pads and you immediately get a better sense of space in the soundstage. It doesn't become dramatically large or expansive, but it's better than the stock pads. The thick pads also bring a little bit of extra smoothness that does taper off some of the top end aggression or energy. I probably shouldn't say aggression. These are not aggressive headphones, I don't think, but they do have a bit of extra energy up top, and the thick pads help to just pull that back ever so slightly. So you're still getting that lovely sense of articulation and attack on the leading edges of notes, but you're getting it delivered all just a little bit more smoothly. The bass from the thick pads is a little bit more present, and it's more because there's an offset between the treble and the bass shifts a little bit, so they're a bit more present in the bass with the thick pads compared to the stock pads, but the thick pads don't sound quite as bassy as the stock pads with the mantle. The next step you can take is to put the mantle on with the thick pads, and I actually quite like that combo. If you listen to these and you find they're just a little bit too energetic for you, the thick pads plus the mantle can be a lovely sound. I've just jumped in here, I was about to pack things up and in the process of getting my office back into order for my normal workday, and what I realised was that I didn't clarify something about the thick pads and even the stock pads with the mantle. And specifically what I wanted to mention was that when I was listening to the thick pads with the mantle, the thing that really stood out to me when I took the mantle away was how much life it brought back to things like breathy sounds through a saxophone. I was listening to the Music Evolution album by Buckshot LaFonque at the time, and what I heard from listening to the saxophones in this album was that when you take the mantle away, you can hear the breath flowing through the saxophone. It gives a sense of life and realism to the sax that I don't think having the mantle on there quite captured. So it is worth keeping that in mind. The mantle is going to smooth things out, but it's also going to rob that little bit of kind of texture and breathiness that can bring sounds to life if you're anything like me and you like to hear those details. It's not that the Caldera has an unnatural sense of detail in those areas, but it's just that it's very revealing in a very subtle way in those areas, and you notice that going between the mantle on and the mantle off. So I just wanted to clarify that one. Now let's get back to the main review. Moving over then to the thin pads, and these are really interesting. They kind of separate out the sounds a bit more in some ways, and yet the soundstage is also more intimate. So you're getting more of a left-right spread, but an excellent sense of separation. They also somehow reduce the sense of upper mid-range emphasis. And so the tonal balance on things like vocals could be a little bit improved over the stock pads. I feel like the thin reduces the soundstage depth even further, it brings it more intimate, but it spreads it more left-right, more separation, and it also balances the upper mid-range tonality a little bit better. The sense of bass presence and weight in the overall frequency response is a little bit reduced with the thin pads as well. And so interestingly, the overall tonality comes across a little bit brighter, but also a little bit smoother, probably because of that upper mid-range pullback. And so I do really like the thin pads. There's been some talk online, some people that have preferred the thin pads and recommended them, and I totally get why. I don't prefer them over the thick pads, but I can understand people liking them. And so that brings us finally around to the suede pads. The suede pads deliver quite a different sound. They sort of make the imaging of them a little bit more diffuse. And what I mean by that is that when you're using the various leather pads, whichever they are, thick, thin or normal, when you're using the leather pads, you're getting a very tight, very cleanly defined image from the Calderas. Whereas the suede pads just kind of feather the edges of the image ever so slightly. It doesn't make it blurry or unfocused, but it's not as focused as with the leather pads. The top end becomes a little bit smoother as well, and what I mean by that is there's a bit less texture in the top end. So there's still a sense of energy and attack, but not quite as much sense of texture. The sound's not quite as breathy, airy, textured, etc. I felt like the suede pads were also just a little bit less intimate compared to the stock pads, but only by a very small amount, to the point that by the time you switch back and forth, it's hard to say if that was real or perceived. It could just be a combination of the factors of that slightly more diffuse image, not feeling quite as close because it's not as focused. So I wouldn't make a huge call about soundstage size based on the suede, but I did feel like it was ever so slightly more spacious. I also felt like the bass was a bit more present, but a bit less kind of tight and punchy perhaps. So the suede is quite a different experience. It's a good sound, but it didn't kind of win me over as my favourite sound. And so really what that means is if we bring it back to if you're ordering or demoing a pair of Calderas, the things I'd recommend is to try it with and without the mantle. And I personally would recommend, if you can, trying with the stock pads, as well as the thick definitely, and maybe the thin. I'm not so sold on the suede. I think there's going to be those out there that love it. I'm not particularly sold on it. It's not bad by any stretch, but I think you can get better sound with the thick or the thin pads. And so if you do buy or try the Calderas, then make sure you get yourself a chance to try at least a couple of pads and try with and without the mantle. Also, don't forget to try a different cable. Give them the benefit of an upgrade to a copper Litz or a silver Litz cable. And as I said before, give them a little bit of time as well. Give your brain a moment to adjust from what you've been coming from, because these sound different to most other headphones. Not vastly different, but in the subtleties, in the technicalities, in their tonal balance, they're just that little bit different. And so for me, I'm going to close things out by saying that this is a headphone, I've already said this already, I know, but this is a headphone that I absolutely love. I enjoy them. I reach for them every single day now, over and above the Elites. The Elites I don't think are going anywhere because they've got their own benefits and their own strengths. But the Calderas for me are just magic. So I want to say a huge thanks to Zach and Bevan over at ZMF and the whole team there for that matter for sending these out for me to try. I'll probably be in touch about getting a pair of my own very soon. And so the final thing I'm going to say is that this is a headphone that I do absolutely recommend, but I also recommend with the caveats I mentioned before. If you skip forward to this point, you will need to jump back and check out what I said because it's too much to go through. I don't want to cover it again, but I think these are a wonderful headphone. I've loved every minute with them, and I hope that you do too. So as always, I hope this video has been useful, interesting, informative. Thank you for sticking with me for a long video on this one, and I hope it's been worth it. If you have enjoyed it, I'd love it if you hit the like button, and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.